we'll jump right into what is the first of 3 2-hour modules on winter maintenance that we've converted over from what we normally do in person in a 1-day shot. So just a quick commercial for those that aren't familiar with us. We're the Delaware T2 Center, or LTAP Center, whichever you like. We are one of 51 centers in all the states in Puerto Rico. We're funded by the Federal Highway, and in our case, Delaware Department of Transportation. And, you know, my words, not theirs. Our mission is to reach out to local agencies, find out what their transportation challenges are, and help them however we can. And so we do that through training like this, most of which we're able to offer for free to local agencies, tech transfer, research, implementation, the whole bit. So, you know, as always, make sure that you contact one of us. If there are any training needs you think we can offer, or if we can't, we'll, if we don't have it, we'll try to find it, or we'll try to develop it for you. So I'm Matt Carter. I'll be today's humorist. And, you know, so my background is in heavy construction and as a design engineer and as a public works director in Cecil County, Maryland, which is where most of my experience with snow and ice control came from. With me today also is Rusty Lee, who directs the center, and Sandy Wolf, who you probably all heard from quite a bit. She's the one that keeps Rusty and I in line and keeps the trains running on time. So we are recording today's session so that we'll be able to post it and have it available for others. Our platform today, of course, is Zoom. You know, it has the ability to be interactive, so feel free to use the chat pod and things like that. And we'll show you a little bit real quickly of how to do that. So you should see the kind of banner you see there, that black banner. You should see that at the bottom of your screen. You may have to pull your cursor down to see it. But that gives you the controls that you need for that. You know, it's helpful if you keep your microphone muted when you're not speaking, so that we don't get any sort of background or echoes or things like that. Video, we always like to see your face, but if you're shy, that's fine. So it's a no shame zone. And we're going to we try not to overdo the polls, but we will have a couple of those in this session, just to kind of get a little bit of feedback. So you'll see those. The chat box you should see, again, you should have a thing in the lower part of your screen usually for chat. You can click on that, and you can talk to each other behind my back if you want in little private sessions, or you can share with everybody. You can ask questions, and Rusty and Sandy are going to be monitoring that. And, you know, some of those questions we'll field right away. Some of them, if sort of an answer is coming up on that, they may hold off on that. But feel free to use that. And there's a couple little reactions you can use. They're pretty limited to pretty positive stuff, so that suits me just fine. And questions are always good anytime. I mean, if you know, again, we're on a tight time frame today, but that doesn't mean we can't take a little bit of time out and field some questions, maybe hear a war story. And, you know, certainly if something doesn't sound right, if it doesn't seem true to what you all have experienced or tried, then speak up, because, you know, my experience is what it is. It's certainly based on a lot of rural road primarily. So that's what my direct experience is. And so yours might be different. So let us know. It's always helpful when others chime in. So let's just try the chat pod real quick. If you all could, you know, put in the chat pod your name, the agency, the state where your agency is, because we've got a handful of folks from across the country joining us today. If you want to put something funny or otherwise in there, feel free. And if you've got, I know DRBA has several people there. If you want to just indicate their names or say there's 5 of us or whatever, that suits us fine too, just so we kind of know who's in the audience. So while you do that, I'm going to just sort of jump in and start setting the table for this a bit. So like I said, there's 3 modules here. The first one today is, you might think of it as planning. It's going to be a little bit of introduction, but we're going to sort of cover the broad range of pieces that go with winter maintenance. And in module 2, we're going to focus on preseason activities, what I like to call game day, the plowing operations, and things that we should think about for post-storm operations. And in module 3, we're going to, more game day stuff, but with a focus on the ice side of it and what we do with, various materials, be it sand, be it de-icing materials, so-called freeze point depressants, liquids, things like that. And then we'll just end with some postseason recommendations as well. So that's sort of what we're going to do. But today we're going to do an introduction and some stuff on planning. So I developed this class probably close to 10 years ago, or about 10 years ago, I think. And, we really sort of developed it from the ground up. There's lots of great winter maintenance training all around, but a lot of it had gotten a little bit dated. And so went back and really started from scratch. And we drew on a lot of resources, including people resources here in Delaware and in Cecil County to vet some of the materials. And part of the reason I bring that up is that you'll see in the lower left corner of a lot of the slides, something that sort of indicates, you don't see it on this one, but you'll see in others, you'll see a reference to some of these materials like an NCHRP report or things like that. And I do that partly because I want you to see where we've drawn that information, but I also encourage you to go and look at those materials if you want to dig in a little bit deeper. I also should say that we'll have the slides available for this. Sandy is loading these specific ones. We have our existing full day ones on our website, but she's going to load up these from today as well on our website. And Sandy, if you could put into the chat pod at some point a link to our website so that folks can have it there as to where they can find those materials, that'd be great. So jumping into this, so sort of the first of a couple sections we're going to go through today. This first part is really just sort of a general introduction where I want to sort of introduce you to a few concepts that we'll talk about off and on as we go through. And so let's jump into those. So for our first poll question, I'll put that up now. Oh, okay, Rusty, I think I already got it. So, just give us an idea of what role you play, realizing you may very well have multiple hats. We've got a little over half of you in. Give it another second here for folks to jump in. Okay. Can only twist arms just so much, right? So we'll do that and we'll share the results. So, part of why I like to do this is to get a sense of sort of quote, who's in the room, but also to sort of reinforce with us that there's a lot of different roles that people play. We tend to think of just plow operators, but there's supervisors and elected officials and front office people and mechanics and folks like that. And all those roles are important. And I think part of what I like to accomplish in this session where we talk about planning is to try to get everybody sort of understanding what others in the process and in the operation might be doing, because that's helpful to sort of understand why they're doing what they're doing as well. So stop sharing that. So regardless, hopefully you'll come out of this with, if not some new insights, some things that maybe you hadn't thought about in a while, and maybe we'll convince you to think things just a little bit differently. So let's talk about objectives. Won't belabor the point, but I think it's important to step back and, remember, if you will, why are we engaged in this each winter? Safety certainly comes to mind, and you'll probably hear me repeat the notion a few times that the safety of our own personnel really is job one, and that's because if we get injured, if we have a crash or something like that, then that takes us out of the fight, and that doesn't do anybody any good. And it's really easy to get caught up in the operation and sort of forget about our own well-being. We might get in a hurry, we might take a slip and fall. It's just really important to think about our own safety. But obviously we're thinking about, the movement of emergency responders and others, and the folks that, just despite how we plead and beg, won't stay off the roads. There's other parts, obviously, too. We're increasingly subjected to performance measures. We'll talk a little bit about that. And we're held to cost effectiveness sort of standards increasingly, as we well should. There's some environmental protection issues that are on the rise that increasingly will be asked to sort of tighten up the ship a little bit on. But a big part also is that, having the roads open sooner rather than later and having them, free for the traveling public is key to economic vitality. We certainly want to cut down on traffic crashes, whether they're fatal. Certainly we want to avoid those, but even if they're less serious crashes, they just don't do anybody any good. And increasingly you'll see that we'll talk a lot about other modes of travel as well, like pedestrians and cyclists, and we've got to think about their safety as well. The winter weather impacts, all kinds of things that sort of translate into time and money for things. And so it's really important that we do what we do it efficiently, we do it effectively, and we do it safely. Now, I want to think just for a minute about this, because I think that this is a key part of how we should think about this as we go along. And I want you to think about, the notion of controllable versus uncontrollable factors. Because I'm going to argue to you that spending any amount of time wringing your hands about things that are outside of our control is a waste of time, a waste of energy, and a waste of frustration. We really have to identify those things that we can exercise some kind of control and focus on those and put all of what we've got into that. So, what are those uncontrollable factors? Well, some of them sort of come to mind pretty quickly. We can't control when it snows or an ice storm or what have you. The rate, whether it starts, at 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon or on a weekend or on a Wednesday. The types of precipitation that we get, which we're going to talk about later as well. None of those things are in our control. Now, we can do a lot of research on them and get some good information, and that'll help us control some of the other factors for sure. But there's just really no sense in wringing our hands over the storm itself, because there's not much we can do about it other than do our best to understand the forecasts. The environment we have is the environment we have. So, luckily in Delaware, at least mostly luckily for us, we're pretty flat. So we don't have as many of the sharp topography issues to deal with. We certainly have plenty of sharp curves, and we've got lots of cul-de-sacs and bridges and things like that to deal with. And, what we have in our jurisdiction is what we have. And so, those we can't control either, at least not in the short term. The types of traffic that's going to be out there, whether it's, during the storm, in the wane of the storm or afterwards, we can try to influence a little bit through sort of some of our public outreach, but we can't control that either. For the most part, we probably can't control driver attitudes. I would argue to you that, and will during the planning phase of this, that a little bit of positive outreach to the community might win some hearts and minds and get them on our sides a little bit, but there's always going to be those that are going to be sort of problem children to us. So, we really want to focus on those things that we can control, and that's what we're going to spend the rest of our time on. So, an ice control program or an ice control plan, a winter maintenance plan, whether it's a formal thing, an informal thing, a written document, not, you know, some collection of things, and we'll talk about that, probably should include these types of things at least, right? And we're going to talk about levels of service here in just a minute to introduce that concept. But we really just, you know, we want our planning or our program or whatever you want to call it to be geared towards some of these things. We want it to be financially accountable. We want to make good use of the resources that are provided to us, whether that's equipment, manpower, materials, facilities, whatever. So speaking of levels of service, so I'll introduce it here. We'll come back and revisit it again in a little bit more detail. You know, this is a term that we use in other areas of transportation. Most commonly when we talk about, for example, intersections, we want to know what's the level of service. So we'll talk about, you know, is this a level of service A, B, C? You know, a typical intersection probably would operate at a level of C, and that's probably sufficient for most intersections. And I think the lesson there applies to what we do in winter maintenance. Our goal with intersections is not to have every intersection in our system operate at level of service A. The public might be surprised by that. That's not a good use of resources. You know, most of them can meet their needs by being a level of service C or B. The same goes with levels of service, or you could call them expectations. You could use different terms with winter maintenance. And so, but it's important that we establish what those levels of service that we believe we can provide in a given storm, so that we're communicating that to the public so that we can manage expectations, and elected officials for that matter, so that you know, we're all on the same page as to what we believe we can provide, whether it's during the storm or in the immediacy afterwards. These are just a couple of examples. Again, we're going to come at this a couple of different times because I think it's a really important process of building your program. And so here you would look at, you know, you might be determining, well, for different kinds of roads, if I have a subdivision street that's lightly traveled, I might have a lower level of service or a later level of service, you might think of it. Whereas, you know, on a higher type road that has, you know, higher traffic, is, you know, a connector between important government functions, hospitals, police, fire, those might very well have a higher level of service. And so, you know, and we can express those in different ways. We can talk in terms of, are we going to have a bare pavement standard for a certain road or route or area? Will they be substantially bare? Will they be, you know, one lane open, et cetera? So there's different ways that we can express those. And it's less important what we actually decide on, but that we go through a process where we ask ourselves, what is it that we should be providing or striving for on a given route? So pictorially, if you will, this is another way to look at levels of service. And so, you know, just my assessment, if you look at the photo on the right, you know, this was taken, you know, sort of pre-dawn, just as the sun was about to come up. The storm had come through. It was a relatively light storm. You can kind of see from the surrounding areas overnight. And, you know, this is when you're at the early stages of the commute. I would argue that for a route like this, you know, this is an acceptable level of service at that point in the storm for a prudent driver. And if I was in the classroom, I would see some eyes roll when I say prudent driver. You know, that is the standard that we're held to, right? We don't design roadways and we don't maintain roadways for lunatics. They're out there, but if they decide to conduct themselves recklessly, drive too fast on a slick road, have a vehicle that's not in good working condition, that's largely on them, right? We have to be able to rely on the fact that their vehicles will be in reasonable working order, and that they will be alert, prudent drivers. If they're driving with a cell phone in their hand and texting and go off the road under these conditions, that's not something we can control. And so we've got to focus on providing a level of service that a prudent driver can navigate safely. The other ones, if you look at that, these are probably later on in the storm, after the storm stopped. Again, you look at that lower left when the intersection's a little slushy, but a prudent driver can navigate that just fine. Now, if they come flying through that intersection at 35 miles an hour, they're probably going to have some problems with it, but that's not a prudent driver. So these are probably reasonable levels of service, assuming that we don't have unreasonable expectations from the community or our elected officials. Other examples dealing with sidewalks. These, on the left are probably reasonable levels of service for what appears to be relatively shortly after a storm. The one on the lower right, we're going to have to do some work on that, and we'll talk some more here and there about sidewalks. We really have to start thinking about sidewalks as the next lane of travel, or traffic rather. Pedestrian traffic has to be accessible under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and we're only halfway there in that instance. So we're going to have to up our game a little bit in some areas, particularly when we start talking about curb ramps, or we've got another name for them now, pedestrian something. But one of the things to think about in the upper left thing, which we'll talk about from time to time in these three modules, is the notion of refreezing, right? And so, as probably most of you know, as we go through a storm, it doesn't end when the precipitation ends. And really in the days that follow, we've got to be mindful of areas like that, and come back and retreat those areas, or in the long term, try to avoid this kind of refreezing activity altogether if we can. So there's, I alluded to this earlier, there's environmental concerns. We won't dwell on these a lot. We'll sort of touch base here and there, but there are environmental concerns, particularly when we get into Module 3 and we talk about some of the materials we use, not just chemicals, but even sand. We really do have to be increasingly mindful. And here in Delaware and in most states, the Environmental Protection Agency, DNREC in our case, are increasingly sort of ratcheting up some of the expectations they have for us for controlling those materials because of their potential to damage the environment. Those are going to benefit us in cost savings if we do it well. So we shouldn't be afraid of that. We can sort of, kill two birds with one stone, which is probably a bad metaphor given I'm talking about the environment, but nonetheless. So you're going to see this slide from me probably a couple more times through these modules, because I want to kind of reinforce this to you periodically through this. It's very natural in the same way that, again, I spoke about ADA a moment ago. When I say ADA or disabled pedestrians, most of you would very naturally picture in your mind somebody in a wheelchair. Well, that's just one of the disabilities that we really need to think about, the physical disabilities. There are people who have walkers, there are people with low vision who are blind, deaf, and so all those disabilities matter. In the same vein, it's pretty natural when we talk about winter storms, we tend to think about snow. That's understandable, but we really need to think about all the different forms that precipitation can take during a winter storm. These are really sort of the most basic ones, right? There's variants on these themes to be sure, but we really want to think about this because it really goes into the strategy for how we sort of suit up for a given storm in particular, but even how we develop our program so that we're planning well for it. We'll come back to this and we'll use this in a couple of different ways as we go along. When we think about weather and we're looking for information, forecasts, things like that, we don't want to just know at any given point what is about to happen. it's helpful to think about what has happened in the preceding days or even weeks, what is happening right now, because the forecast is one piece of information we have. But an example of this that's useful is think about any given storm. You know, a 2-inch fluffy snowstorm. That storm is, we're going to gear up for it, and it's going to give us a certain amount of headache in late December. But if I get that same storm in late February, it's probably going to fight me a lot more. And part of why that is because in late December, in all likelihood, the pavement and the subgrade are still warmer relative to what they're going to be after a good hard cold freeze through January and February. And so any given storm is probably going to be easier for us to fight in the early part of the season. And so even thinking about what's happened in the last few weeks, or if we've had multiple other storms that have occurred, if we had an icing event that happened overnight and now it's starting to snow, that's going to change it. So it's important to think about what has happened, what is happening, and what is likely to happen going forward. And again, we want to think about all those different precipitation modes because it is going to help us with our strategy. It's going to help us know better when to start and stop and change various treatments. One of the other things, again, we're interested in a lot of things about the weather, and increasingly, I mean, we all like to make fun of the weatherman. That's as American as apple pie. And so we'll continue to do that, of course. But the reality is that weather information has gotten a lot better in the last 10, 20, even 30 years. And we can get a lot of information. The air temperature is probably one of the least useful pieces of information to us most of the time. What we really want to know is what's the temperature of the pavement, because that's where the action's happening. That's the interface, if you want to think about it that way. That's where the stuff falls and we've got to deal with it. We're also interested in the subsurface temperatures if we can get it, which in Delaware we can, and we'll talk about that more later on. The dew point can be of interest to us because in particular, that can tell us a little bit about black ice. You know, black ice catches us off guard way too many times. And if we pay attention to the dew point at certain parts of the year, it needn't necessarily take us by surprise. And again, we'll hit on that later. And we'll talk more about where we can get some of that information later. Training, obviously, you're here today, so you're a believer in training. There's lots of different ways to get training. We try to provide it. There's training online through these modules. We'll point you to some great YouTube videos that we think are useful from different groups across the country. You know, with training, we can remind folks. I mean, we haven't had a tough snow and ice winter to speak of for the last 3 or 4 years, right? So some folks are new to the field and have never really fought a significant storm. For the rest of us, we haven't probably done it for 2, 3, 4 years. We get a slam banger this year. We want to sort of knock off the cobwebs and blow off the dust and any other metaphor I can come up with that reminds us some of the dangers, some of the techniques we need to use, et cetera. You know, there's new equipment comes along. We'll touch on some of that in module 2. It may not necessarily be new to us, but it's new to some. We're real big believers in the LTAP community about tailgate safety talks. And we think that, you know, in particular, you know, before each storm, but certainly before the first significant storm of the year, pull the crew together, take 10 minutes, buy a round of donuts and coffee, and just talk about, hey, you know, things are going to be slippery out there. 3 points of contact getting in and out of equipment, things like that, to make sure that people don't get hurt. You know, a lot of that is a little bit like telling you to look both ways before you cross the street. But there's a reason why your parents said that over and over and over and over again, because safety bears repeating, and we just sort of need reminders. Simulator training is on the rise, and it's been utilized pretty heavily by some groups for 10, 12, 15 years around here, including some of these entities. It hasn't been as accessible for some of us because you kind of have to buy it in bulk when you're renting the equipment, and that's been a frustration of ours. And the T-Squared Center here in Delaware, you know, Rusty and I have been sort of searching for a better solution to that for probably 5 or 6 years now. And our stubbornness has sort of paid off because just this year, the Delaware Deltec has stood up 2 brand new state-of-the-art simulators in their Middletown, Delaware facility. They've hired an instructor. They've got a number of programs there, and we've been instrumental in helping them stand that curriculum up and get that program going. And the first handful of training sessions have been going on over the last few weeks. So that's a brand new opportunity in Delaware, and a much lower cost, which is nice. So we think that that's a really positive development, and we're happy because we've been fighting for it for a long time. So I just want to introduce you to this as, you know, under the topic of training. There's a link on the right, and again, the easiest way to do that will either be to search on YouTube or go right to this link, get the slides off of our website and click on that link in either location here. I really think these are worth their time. I think that, you know, in November and December, maybe take a handful of you know, lunch times or tailgate safety slots, or anytime you can squeeze loose, you know, anywhere from 3 to 15 minutes, which is what these things run, and watch at least some of these. The topics are good. They get in and get out of them. It may very well be Iowa, where they develop, and these have all been updated in 2019, so they're current and modern. The equipment might look a little bit different, but they face the same kind of storms we do. And I think these are some good training videos to remind us about some things. So I would really endorse taking a look at these. This is a tough topic. I won't dwell on it, but I feel like I can't not raise it. And when I was developing this course in, I guess 2011, that summer, I think it was, I remembered that there had been a fatality the previous winter, which had been a pretty brutal winter on the East Coast, here in Delaware with a snowplow. And I couldn't quite remember the details, so I went back and I started searching the web. I wanted to see, and you see that in the upper left. But what struck me was this: if you pay close attention to these, I think almost all of them were the same storm. So up and down the East Coast, there were pedestrians or cyclists that were struck, in some cases fatalities, by a snowplow operator. I took a little time with these and I dug through each one of these. And in each one of these, including the Delaware case, the investigation showed that the plow operator was not at fault. They didn't do anything wrong. They were operating correctly. They were following procedures. The trucks were in good order. There were, you know, no safety concerns with the vehicle itself, et cetera. I'm not blaming the pedestrian or the cyclist. That's not my point. My point of this is, in each of these cases, and there were others, you know, there were serious injuries or even fatalities. And in each case, we were doing the right thing. So imagine if instead we decide to be a little casual, we are cowboys, we go a little bit fast, we don't pay as much attention, we get distracted, we get fatigued, we don't keep our equipment up the way we should. If these kinds of things can happen when we're doing it the right way, imagine what can happen when we start to slide. So I just think it's an important thing to bear in mind. We should, you know, again, by way of sort of introduction, we should, and in our planning process, we should be open to innovation, playing around with new things, the evolution of materials. I know sometimes there's the whole, well, we've never done it that way here. Well, maybe it's time to try it. And I would encourage you to be open to new ideas and new materials and new approaches. If they don't work for you, they don't work for you. Dip your toe in the water a little bit. Again, there can be new equipment, new materials. It's certainly not new at this point. It's 30 years old, but the Americans with Disabilities Act really raises the standards on us. And we're going to have to do some things that 30 years ago we didn't really think about. You know, just like environmental issues, these are gonna crank up on us. So we really need to get out ahead of this and think about new ways to deal with ADA issues and even other multimodal sort of objectives, cyclists, pedestrians, et cetera, which we'll talk about some more later on. Just real briefly, I won't dwell on this. There's a really, you know, again, in the lower left, you'll see reference to this NCHRP transportation law document on tort liability. Tort liability is a term the lawyers use. A lot of us know it as negligence lawsuits, et cetera. For the most part, you know, if we do our jobs well, we don't have to worry a whole lot about this. But some agencies and some you know, snow fighters do, and it's worthy of thinking about in your planning process. I won't belabor what they say. There's just a couple of slides here, but generally speaking, and I'm not a lawyer. I'm simply reporting the news here, if you will. But in essence, what the courts collectively have said is if the agency that's responsible for a given roadway has established what those expectations are for winter maintenance, and they have gone about a reasonable process to bring that about, then if something happens, someone gets harmed, equipment, you know, personal property gets damaged, et cetera, then generally speaking, the courts don't hold the agency responsible for that. Now, conversely, if we've allowed people to have very high expectations of what we could deliver, and then we don't do that, and in fact, we don't even really take good steps towards doing that, we could expose ourselves to this. So that comes back and reinforces, in my mind, the need for establishing levels of service and communicating them to the public so that they have reasonable expectations of us, not unreasonable ones. There's also things with trespass and nuisance. I mean, we certainly get some calls. Hey, you know, you plowed snow and now my wilderberry bush is turned brown because there was too much salt. If we genuinely overdo it with the salt, we could be exposed to this. But reasonable use of salt and other materials is considered to be consistent with what we're supposed to be doing as a road agency. Again, talk with your legal counsel if you're concerned about any of this, but this is sort of the summary of that NCHRP study, which I think is a pretty good document to use. You know, we'll touch on safety from time to time because it bears repeating. We really do have to think about first and foremost, the safety of our own personnel, so that we can stay in the fight, stay healthy. You know, we have new concerns now with the COVID virus, and we've got to think about, you know, we could have one person on our crew that catches the virus or tests positive for it, and we might have to shut the whole crew down or some of their equipment for the duration of the storm. Well, what are we going to do then? So that's a new concern. That's a new challenge we have to think about that falls under the idea of safety and planning, that we really should, all of our agencies should be thinking about this. Is there a mutual aid agreement we can have with a neighboring town or county or what have you, so that, you know, if something like that did happen, can we get some assistance? We ought to walk through this process. I don't have magical answers for you because it really does become agency specific, but it's something that's new for us that we should be thinking about. You know, a good safety plan serves us well. I'm probably preaching to the choir. I hope I am, because we should do this in all of our operations, not just winter maintenance. The other part of this is I feel strongly that safety culture starts with management. You know, there should be accountability. There also, you know, everybody should, the best program that you want to establish that you want people to comply with is one where it applies to everyone. There's not exceptions. There should be no reason that when I roll out on your you know, job site, your construction site, and you're all wearing safety vests and hard hats, that I go, well, no, it's okay. You know, I'm management. I don't have to. It's either important or it's not. And so our safety programs should be the same way. And everybody in the organization, from the top on down, should be held to the same safety standards. And that's really how you get to a really good safety culture in your operation. You know, throughout you know, things like training and safety rodeos and things, or snowplow rodeos, when we can get our hands on them, are great things. So, you know, anything we can do to sort of further the safety culture in our organization. We should think about, you know, whether it's equipment safety or equipment readiness. Again, we're going to come back to this in the planning phase when we talk about that in a few minutes. But again, this is one of those, so I talked about controllable and uncontrollable factors, right? If in the middle of a big storm, one of our trucks or our loaders go down because the brakes have failed, I don't want to know that, I don't want to hear from the operator, yeah, a couple of weeks ago, I noticed those brakes were a little spongy. Well, that was the time to bring that up, when the mechanics could have a look at it, repair it, and make sure it was ready for the fight. That's an unforced error, right? We shouldn't have those. And those are the ones where our face should turn red. If it's the kind of thing that just comes up, well, then okay, fair enough. We couldn't have anticipated it. But things like, you know, broken welds on a snowplow, we ought to be at the beginning of the season going over our snowplows to look for those kinds of things. And, you know, I don't want the mechanics and the welders to come over and say, this has been broken for a long time. It just finally gave up the ghost. Well, now I've got a piece of equipment that's out of the fight. We could have repaired it a few days ago, a few weeks ago, and our readiness could have been more secure. So we really, again, this is a controllable factor. And so this is one where we should wring our hands. We should think about it. We should take action on it. Same with safety gear. Again, there's, you know, you have to decide what kind of safety gear ought to be in, whether it's, you know, the center of your operations or in the plow trucks or the loaders or what have you. But we ought to be prepared for what we reasonably anticipate might happen. And some of these things are the things we should be thinking about with that. Drugs and alcohol, I'm quite certain I'm preaching to the choir at this point. I hope so. But drugs and alcohol just don't have any place in winter maintenance. And, you know, we tend to think about CDL drivers and things like that, where, you know, it's a very well-established law, but this ought to apply to everybody in our organization. Increasingly, you know, we have, you know, a real problem with prescription medications, for example, and things like that. Somebody that's back at the, you know, the center of operations taking phone calls from the public, I don't want them loopy on some kind of a, you know, pharmaceutical when they're talking to the public. It's not going to go well. So, you know, obviously, if that's prescribed and, you know, legit and what have you, well, then we have to make a decision as to who's the best to do that. Those are other issues, but we certainly don't want misuse of drugs or alcohol in any form, and it ought to be an absolute, you know, line in the sand for us. You know, I mentioned multimodal before. Again, whether you like it or not, historically we dealt with streets and roads only, but increasingly we're going to be drawn into this. Somebody is going to have to deal with sidewalks and curb ramps and other areas, and we're probably going to be called on to do it. So we want to broaden sort of what our thinking is about what kind of equipment, what kind of personnel, what kind of techniques should we be using. I like this guy because I just, I mean, one shovel wasn't enough for this guy. He's going out and getting it done. When we start talking about sidewalks and other pedestrian pathways or plazas, again, increasingly, we shouldn't be doing that with shovels. That's occupational injury waiting to happen if we do it on any kind of large scale. And so increasingly, there's a lot of good equipment here. I'm going to this is a quick video to illustrate this. You've probably seen this. Whoops. So it's remarkable what you can do with, in this case, this is on the UD campus where, we've got mowers that are used all summer long as commercial mowers, and they can be converted over. And it's remarkable what you can accomplish with a small machine, rubber cutting edges and even brooms. The cyclists are going to be out there. The pedestrians are going to be out there. If you look at this lower right and you see the bike tracks through this area, they're going to be there. If that sidewalk is within our jurisdiction and somebody takes a fall and we have not managed expectations of the safety for that area, then that's going to come back on us. And we're going to have to be increasingly mindful of what our obligations there are. This is always a little bit controversial because some folks want to keep, an arm's length between public works and the elected officials. Sometimes you get a lot of grief from elected officials. They don't necessarily understand what you're up against. I would argue to you, invite them along for a plow ride. Let them see what it's like, what kind of tension and anxiety you're dealing with during one of those runs. But there are folks, there's agencies here in Delaware that have public works days where they invite the public in, bring the kids in, put them in the trucks, in the loaders. It's part of how you win hearts and minds, or at least you try to. Okay, so that was the introduction, sort of where we set the table. Now I want to spend the rest of our time today going through really a snow and ice control plan. And when I say a snow and ice control plan, and I'll probably repeat myself on this, immediately what comes to mind is, hiring a consultant, paying a lot of money. It's no offense to consultants. 3-ring binders full of materials that are put on the shelf that nobody ever reads. There are certain agencies where that needs to happen. When you're a large enough agency, you kind of need that. DelDOT has that. DRBA may have that. And that's fine. I mean, when you get to a sizable operation, you may very well need that. But regardless of whether you do that or not, the point is that when I talk about a snow and ice control plan, I'm really talking about a process. I don't care if nothing ever gets written down. Now, I would argue on the back end, certain things need to be written down. But the plan, the physical plan at the end is less important than the thinking process that goes through, that the people on the ground are very involved in to the extent that that's possible. So I want to talk about some of the things that ought to be taken into consideration as you go through that process. So let me start by asking this. This is a poll question. You can, I think let me launch the right one. There we go. So can you see that poll? Does your agency currently have, oops, I have to launch it. Not so good at this. So does your agency currently have a winter maintenance plan? If you guys can weigh in on that for us. It's okay, it's anonymous, so nobody knows what you're telling us. Okay. Wait just another second here. we get any others. So we got a little more than half. So okay. Polling and share the results. So we've got a little bit of a mixed bag, and that's not unusual, right? I mean, so some folks have a written plan, it's up to date, it's ready to go. Oftentimes, you know, we've got one, but we haven't revisited it in 10 or 15 years. It's probably time to have another look at it. And some work from a collection of different pieces, right? Some of which they use year round. There's standard operating procedures and other things. And that can be fine, or I'm going to argue to you that can be fine as well. Again, what it manifests itself as is a little bit less important, I think, at least for most agencies, than the thinking process that ought to go on from time to time. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out. I think that's the last poll I'm going to bother you with today. So, you know, you can't be a trainer and not use a quote once in a while. And Winston certainly hit gold here, and he's right. If we're out there just winging it, then the controllable factors that goof us up during a storm and we get lambasted by the media and elected officials, well, we only have ourselves to blame if we really didn't give it some thought along the way and have a plan of attack that's reflective of modern times and the storms that we're after. So let's talk about that planning. So again, it can come out in a lot of different ways. It may manifest itself as ordinances, resolutions, again, sort of at that elected official level in, you know, the municipal code, the county code, the state codes. It may be in the way of an actual plan, a written plan, usually either developed or coordinated by senior management, but hopefully with at least some input from staff, the folks who are on the ground, that know the routes, that know the culture of the road, the personality of the roads. It may, again, as some of you implied in that poll, manifest itself as some collection of procedures or guidelines or other kinds of things. So it can sort of end up in a number of different ways. You know, one of the things that ought to be established in that is who's running the the battle, if you will. This is one of the things that comes up is in the midst of the storm, suddenly there are multiple voices trying to direct the operation. They may be well-meaning, but it just leads to confusion. And the last thing that the folks who are in the plow trucks and loaders and other pieces of equipment need is to hear conflicting direction. And so it really is important that we have somebody in charge and that we've got sort of a chain of command. You know, we should establish through our ordinances levels of service. Again, we're going to come back to that. Also, what's expected of others, right? So, for example, if there's an established hydrant adoption, fire hydrant adoption program in town, we have that in some communities where, you know, the adjoining neighbor can volunteer to say, yep, I'll take care of that in the big storms, make sure it's clear. We want to remind them of that obligation, or if that's the fire department that's assumed that responsibility, presumably that would be a priority of theirs anyway, but we might want to just get out ahead of the season and remind them about that. One of the things that here in the center is quite commonly the local ordinance about snow removal will say something like public works will be called out when there is 2 inches of snow on the ground. It says it more eloquently than that, but that's the gist of it. We really need to revisit that kind of language. And that's something that you might want to try to impress upon your elected officials. It's not very helpful. I mean, you can argue whether that's a good policy to begin with. By the time, if it's a big storm coming, and it's starting at 2 in the morning, then if you just call your forces out when there's already 2 inches on, by the time they get in and get vehicles up and running and loaded and out the door, you may be well behind that storm. So that kind of very specific ordinance can be real troublesome to us. The other part of it is that most of those ordinances only talk about snow. Even the ordinances that talk about the requirements for adjoining property owners to clear sidewalks. They'll say, you know, the adjoining property owners must remove snow within 4 hours, 8 hours of the storm, of a snowstorm, or they'll be fined, you know, $100 or whatever. That's great. But what if it's an ice storm and there's, you know, a half an inch of ice on the sidewalk? The ordinance didn't say anything about that. So we really want to sort of make sure that if we have an ordinance or something like that, that it really reflects reality and provides the kind of direction that we can actually act on. Get off that particular soapbox for now. So in our snow and ice removal plan, again, we should have objectives. That goes back to what I was talking about at the very beginning of this, or it ought to reflect those, right? And again, I believe that it should, early on in the process, there should be a discussion. What kind of levels of service do we think we can provide for the residents of our community, the users of the roads that we're responsible for? And I'll come back with a few more examples of that in just a minute. Again, what might be, this is a typical kind of table of contents, maybe, of the things that might go into such a plan if you're actually going to write up the plan. And again, this may take the form of several different documents even. But these are the kinds of things we want to walk through. So we're back to levels of service. So, and I think this is probably the last time I'm going to talk about this in any depth today. But this ought to be one of the early things that we talk about in this process, this brainstorming session, this planning session or sessions that we have, every couple of years, where we step back and look at our operation and see whether it's as good as it can be. And we start with, what's the community expect from us? So I was at the APWA Snow and Ice Conference a couple of years ago, and it was in Indianapolis. And we did a tour of the Indianapolis Public Works Department, and they showed us, they have a computer program that tracks things and does a nice job that they built in-house, and they were showing that. And in the course of that, the DPW director said, so in Indianapolis, we don't plow residential streets. And then he moved on, and he got a couple sentences, and I raised my hand. I said, I'm sorry, did you say you don't plow residential streets? He said, nope. And I said, long story short, we had a discussion about that. And I said, I got to tell you, back east, that's just not going to fly. He said, that's the expectation here. The public knows it. He said, don't get me wrong, in a really big slam banger, we'll go through and we'll knock the worst of it off of those streets once we're done with the rest of the streets. He said, but that's just the way we do it. And so you can have very, very different sort of expectations in different parts of the country. But we ought to start with that. What does the public expect of us? Do we think we can provide that? If not, we better tell them that. And we better tell the elected officials that if that's what's expected of us, we're going to need different things in terms of equipment, manpower, policies, authorizations, things like that. So levels of service is a key sort of focal point for this process. We want to go in, again, look at some of the things here. We want to think about different kinds of storms. We want to think about what's available to us in terms of equipment and manpower and overtime issues and things like that. What do we have the ability, what's our ability to store materials? If we can only store materials for a relatively moderate storm, then it's not reasonable to think that we're going to be able to fight a big storm with, the big sort of mother lode storm with any kind of a significant level of service because we simply don't have the material on hand to deal with it through the long slog. So, you know, and that may be an area where we say that's a gap that maybe we can do something about. And so this process of thinking about it also sort of shows you the weakness in your particular operation. You say, this is where we could really up our game, and maybe it's achievable financially for us to tackle that. Again, we should think about levels of service in terms of what we think we can provide during the storm and after the storm. And oftentimes these are two different things. So it may be that I say, look, I can give you 1 lane passable, not bare, 1 lane passable during the storm, a typical storm, whatever that is. For a typical storm, you know, 4, 6, 7 inches of snow, within 6 or 8 hours after the storm, I can give you 75% bare pavement or wheel tracks or whatever. Again, what is it that I can do? And express it in those 2 terms, but it should be doable and practical for our operation. If it's not reflective of what we're really capable of doing with the manpower and equipment we have, then it's just it's a hollow promise, and that doesn't do anybody any good. Again, these are some of the ways we might express it. And, you know, some of these are more suitable for one agency versus another, or one jurisdiction versus another. But we can use all these different ways to express it. We can talk in terms of the condition of the pavement, you know, 2 hours after a storm, 8 hours after a storm, during a storm. We can talk about, as I said before, different types of highways, whether they're multi-lane highways or roadways versus, you know, more typical roadways that a lot of us would deal with, whether they're highly traveled or lightly traveled. And so again, there's all kinds of different terms that we should think about using. And again, this is one of those things. This is one of those NCHRP reports, which I think I link you to, but if not, if you have any problems finding it, it's free online. It's worth going through because it talks about some of these things in more depth than we have time for today. We should sort of consistent with levels of service should be some thinking about priorities, right? And again, this is something that we have to express to the public in our sort of outreach campaigns, because you know, oftentimes the calls that we get, you know, we've got a relatively heavy storm. It might be, you know, again, a more significant snowstorm, for example, 6, 8 inches of snow. It's been going on for a while, and you get a call from somebody that says, hey, I live on the cul-de-sac, you know, at the back of the residential subdivision, and a plow hasn't been through yet. And we hem and haw and struggle with that. And the answer ought to be, although this is why I'm not allowed to talk to the public, but the answer ought to be, yeah, we're not going to be there for a while yet either. So again, you find somebody who's a little bit more adept at talking to the public than me, but you find a nicer way to say that, and you explain, you say, you know, is anything wrong there? You know, are you having any problems? Because if so, we want to know that so we can make sure we clear a route for, you know, emergency services, be that police or fire or ambulance or what have you. Certainly tell us that. But short of that, what we're doing is making sure that our primary routes are cleared so that we can get to all areas of the community, then our secondary routes, so that if in fact there's a problem at your house at the end of that street, we know we've got all the major routes cleared, and it's just a matter of beating the paramedics there, which we can do, and get that path cleared, that last, you know, few hundred feet, quarter mile, whatever it is. And so establishing those priorities and knowing what those are, and then communicating to the public is part of that expectations management system that we ought to have. We ought to think about sort of different areas of our community. You know, is this a Sunday night storm and school is going to open come hell or high water tomorrow morning? Well, then we need to think about the areas around those schools or significant school routes, school bus routes. What about around hospitals? If it's, you know, or the traffic management center, or the, you know, the center of operations of government, things like that. Is there a big town hall meeting that's coming up tomorrow night or tomorrow morning. Well, we want to make sure that you know, we sort of focus on that and don't get behind with it, because we know that that's, the storm's going to be open and people are going to want to go to it. So so some of these things aren't the same all the time, right? Maybe there's a big maybe there's a Christmas parade coming up, right, in a couple of days. That may change some of our priorities. So it may not be the same sort of cookie cutter approach for every storm, but we ought to establish sort of our standard priorities so that can drive what our planning is. To the extent, you know, we're all getting pulled into performance measures. We shouldn't be afraid of that. We're all serious about what we do. The key is with any kind of performance measure, we ought to make sure that we're being graded on performance on things that we can actually do something about. You know, so don't tell me we did a bad job of snow removal, but you've given us 20% of the materials and equipment and manpower that we need, and we've expressed that to you over the last several years. That's not reasonable, right? So we want to talk about things that we can actually make a difference in, and then make sure that we sort of reflect that back and say, that's great, and I think I can meet those performance measures, but I need certain things from you, the elected officials, the budget managers, the public for that matter. We should say, that's great, but I need the public to cooperate with me a little bit more and stay off the roads a little while longer. Otherwise, I can't meet those expectations. So about them as they go on. Again, there's all kinds of things. We tend to focus so much on money. It's not that it's unimportant, but that's really only, you know, don't take your eye off the ball. You know, none of us, I don't know any agency that has all the money they need for snow and ice maintenance. So we certainly ought to be making the case, an intelligent case, for what it is that we need to do it and meet the expectations of the community. But we also ought to be looking at other ways that we can be creative. How can we tap into other resources that we might have? You know, how can we get the public to give us a little bit more assistance by staying out of our way? Anything we can do to move the ball forward so that we can meet those performance results. If all we do is sit around and complain about money, then we're probably going to be perceived as not being very proactive. If instead we're saying, look, we're doing more with less, how about you get us more so that we can do even better? And again, we shouldn't wait for others to establish performance expectations for us. If we get out ahead of that through our planning process, we can manage what those metrics are going to be. And we can say, look, these are the things you ought to hold us accountable to, because those are things that we can actually control and we can actually report to you in a meaningful way, as opposed to some vague thing. You know, Mr. Johnson didn't think you did a very good job. Well, all right, well, I don't know what that means, right? I mean, Mr. Johnson doesn't like me very much. So I'd rather be held to things that we can actually quantify and report back on, and that we can actually control. And again, it should come back to, well, you know, how can we perform better? Maybe through some flexibility, improvisation, new equipment, innovation, things like that, and recognizing that no two storms are alike. And so our planning should reflect a good bit of flexibility and the ability to sort of call an audible, if you will. You know, saying, look, our standard approach to this is this, or our plan at the beginning of the storm was this, but we're seeing some things in the next few hours that tell us we ought to be changing our strategy a little bit. And we need to have that kind of flexibility in our operation. That comes back to somebody being in charge and having a good chain of command so that we can communicate that down through it and report it back up through the chain when the operators who are out on the routes are seeing things that maybe supervision isn't aware of yet. Throughout our planning process, we need to think about manpower quite a bit, right? Manpower, communications, that kind of thing. You know, in the old days, we had things like telephone trees. There might be a couple people on the call that this particular training that remember those, because the only way I was going to be able to get in touch with you if you weren't in front of me was I was going to call you at your house, and you were either home or you weren't. obviously that's changed, right? We went through pagers and all of that. And now we're in a place where most of us are pretty accessible through the phones on our hips or in our pockets or wherever. But nonetheless, we should establish what that is. I want to know that all the people on my crew know that, once snow season, snow and ice season, see, I make the same mistake. Once winter maintenance comes around, they're going to be on call. They need to know what that means. That may mean they can't leave the area. Well, they need to know that so that they don't misunderstand. I want them to know that that phone is to be on, because if I can't get a hold of them for 2 hours to let them know that we're calling up, that's a problem, and we're going to have a discussion about that. Again, I can't hold people accountable to things I haven't communicated to them. So we should all make sure that we're on the same page. Things like meals and rest periods and where people can rest. Again, all agencies are different in terms of what they can provide, but we need to think through that and say, could our operation be more efficient if in fact we provided rest facilities? Could it be more efficient or effective if we brought in meals for people to eat, a big bowl of pasta or something, or paid for them, or however. Again, I'm not suggesting that any of these are the right or wrong answer, but we ought to go through and say, well, what kind of impact would it be? Could we get a good return on our investment? There's old stories. When I do this in person, I often, ask for, sort of shift considerations. And inevitably, somebody offers up that, back in the day, which I'm pretty sure was a Wednesday, that, well, we would just, we would plow, for 3 and 4 days in a row without stopping. It was, maybe people were more superhuman back then. I would argue to you that if we did anything like that, it probably wasn't a great idea. Now, maybe it was reality on the ground because, well, we only had so much manpower and so much equipment, and that's how we had to do it. That shouldn't be our plan long term. We should look for something more reasonable, because fatigued drivers are not going to be safe drivers for themselves or for others. They're not going to be effective. So we really do need to think about how we're going to fight the, particularly a larger storm of, longer duration. What kind of limits there might be on work hours, whether that's union issues or other kinds of things, and who we might draw into the fight, particularly when the big mother lode storm comes every few years. Can we tap into other people within our government agency? When I was Public Works Director in Cecil County, I was able to reach through to my other divisions, to water and wastewater and solid waste. Now, in most storms, I didn't tap them, but I equipped them and trained them so that in those big storms, I could, once they had their facilities under control, they could come out and assist Roads Division. And that was a real sort of force multiplier for us. So again, not everybody has the luxury of doing that. Again, throughout the planning process, ask yourself, maybe you'll discover some that you didn't realize were there. I alluded to this earlier. I mean, this is one of those things where those of us that have been, in the agency for a long while, we take this for granted. But when we bring somebody new into our operation, we shouldn't just assume that they know what being on call means. And it might be different from what it meant at the last agency they were at. So we should say, again, it varies by agency, but it may be that, I'm going to tell you when you're on call, or you're just on call all winter. Well, what is that? Is the expectation, well, I'm telling you that we may get a storm tomorrow and I may call you up and that's a Saturday. So tonight, no drinking. Well, if that's the expectation, I need to tell them that. We need to talk about communications. How can I contact them? Make sure I have the updated phone numbers. Just because I have phone numbers from last year doesn't mean that they're still correct. So we should go through in the beginning of the season and make sure that those things are up to date. We also are ahead of each storm, particularly one that's expected to be larger or greater duration. We should encourage our crews, take care of the family first before you come in. Make sure everything's set up. Make sure the snow shovels are out. Make sure the de-icing chemicals are out where people in the family know where they are. Make sure the battery on the snow blower is charged up and that there's gasoline there to be used if somebody else is going to do that. And that way they don't have to worry about the home front quite so much while they're trying to take care of the agency's operations. In our planning process, again, this is something that we should revisit from time to time and say, what should be our policies? What do we provide to our folks? Are they responsible for all of their equipment, safety and otherwise? Or do we provide safety vests, but that's it? Do we provide boots? Do we provide retroreflective jackets? Gloves? What is it that we provide and what is their responsibility? Because the last thing you want, particularly somebody that's newer to your agency and might have different expectations, is to show up and say, well, I'm not ready for the fight. I don't have gloves. Well, you were supposed to bring your own gloves. Well, I didn't, because where I worked last, they provided them. So we ought to go through that process and say, well, what should we do? So again, with an eye towards not of fairness and all these other things. I don't worry myself a whole lot about fairness so much as I do about reasonable expectations and what's most efficient for our operation. And if by providing somebody boots or a retroreflective parka, I think they're going to be safer, more efficient, and more effective, then I'm going to probably think that that's a good investment for our agency if we can manage it. So again, it's just a process of thinking that we should go through and ask ourselves. So let's talk about equipment a little bit. Again, I'm going to blow through this fairly quickly because most of this stuff we're pretty familiar with, but it just bears some thinking in our process, particularly if we haven't thought about our winter maintenance program for a number of years. We may have new equipment, new materials, new storage facilities, new capabilities that we didn't a number of years ago, and we really haven't been making the most of them. So we should sort of walk through this process. So, there's the obvious things like trucks and, the plows and, front end loaders and things like that. But we may be getting drawn into working with salt brines and things like that. We'll talk more about that in Module 3. Maybe we have a motor grader that's available to us that we were able to pick up a V plow for that, we want to have in our mind that we're probably going to use that in the larger storms, but we want that as part of our arsenal. Support stuff like welders and torches and fuel trucks and things like that. What's available to us, even as sort of a contingent operation, even stuff that we don't necessarily own, but we have relationships with contractors or others nearby that we could tap into if we needed it. Again, do we own it? Do contractors own it? Sister agencies, again, just walking through all the kinds of things that we might be able to utilize in one form or another in the way of equipment, and under what circumstances. So again, we're pretty familiar with most of this stuff. So these are sort of the basics for us. With trucks, over time, as we change out our fleet, we want to make sure the trucks are correctly sized for what our roads are. If I deal with mostly, light urban streets and subdivisions, then I might very well be able to deal with that with, heavy duty pickup trucks with, proper axles and tires and things like that, that are sort of built for endurance. If I have, more significant roads, then I probably got to step up those trucks a little bit or even substantially. Motor graders are great for the, again, particularly out in the rural areas, which is where I cut my teeth with this, just because of the versatility of what we can deal with it. If we have one of these, it shouldn't be sitting unused in a heavy storm. We ought to know that we can use it and figure out how to use it. Loaders increasingly, and backhoes for that matter, are increasingly very versatile pieces of equipment. They have a lot of, they're sort of designed to be purpose tool carriers with quick disconnects and things like that, where we can change out a bucket for a blade, for a snow blower, for a whatever. And again, we might think about this because we say we're going to spend a lot of money on this loader. Perhaps for a small additional amount of money, we could extend the versatility of this piece of equipment by having this attachment or that attachment. So we ought to think about that. That's a long-term planning process as we sort of change out our fleet of equipment. All kinds of plows, we'll talk about those a little bit. Plows, the accessories that go with them, and the cutting edges that we use. We'll just touch on those very briefly. So one-way plows tend to be bigger plows for higher type roads. More typical for a lot of us are some form of reversible plow that we can change the directions of and the angle of and so forth. Most of us, we've got some people on today who know airport plows very well. In fact, I think this is some of you guys's, if I recall correctly. I think Sandy got these photos years ago from you guys. You know, again, most of us don't deal with this stuff, but you guys at DRBA do from time to time. You know, we can have these variable geometry plows. These aren't very practical for big high type roads where we're pushing multi-lane, you know, echelon plowing, but for subdivision streets and cul-de-sacs and what have you, while these tend to be lighter duty plows, they can add a real level of versatility to our operations. So again, depending on what our roads are, these might be the right kind of thing to have in our arsenal. There's stuff that, for the most part, we still don't use around here. We're not big into underbody plows for the most part. For a long time, we weren't wing plow people around here, but in the lower left, that's a Maryland State Highway plow truck with double wings. Increasingly, we're seeing these around in our neck of the woods. And this, for a long time, this used to be something that they talked about in Iowa and the Dakotas and Vermont. And we just said, that's crazy. You know, this can add some versatility to the snowplow. It requires different training for the plow operator, different things to consider in terms of how to properly use those and how to safely use those. V plows, so big V plows for a long time went out of sort of favor. They were mostly used as ornaments for in front of public works facilities and sat there and, you know, something was painted on them. And in, you know, more recent years, we've taken them out of retirement and put them back on equipment. These can be really, really effective in cutting through snowbanks that have blown in on roads from drifting. But they also, as we get drawn into sidewalk maintenance and things like that, they can be a real force multiplier for these small pieces of equipment that maybe have less horsepower and traction, and suddenly we're dividing the forces on the blade, right, and pushing it both left and right instead of trying to shove it all one way or another. So again, these are sort of coming back into the fold, just like wing plows have worked their way back in. We're seeing a lot more, you know, box plows or particularly when we're dealing with large parking lots or pedestrian plazas or things like that. Trip blades are something we don't see too often, but these have their place. They're, you know, they're kind of interesting. I really just came across them probably about 10 years ago when I was out at Con Expo and saw them. Tow plows, again, have worked their way into our neck of the woods. We've got a couple of them in Delaware now with DelDOT. You know, these things are specialty pieces of equipment. This is not for your subdivision street. This is for multi-lane highways, be it interstates, be it SR1 or Route 40 in Delaware. And, you know, this, again, is a force multiplier. This plow can be swung out and turn this plow truck into something that can clear 1.5 to 2 lanes of traffic using the one truck. Cutting edges. So You know, the classical one is a steel or carbide inserts bolted to the moldboard. Increasingly, a lot of agencies have experimented with others, including rubber cutting edges. DelDOT, for example, uses a lot of cutting edges on their rubber cutting edges. University of Delaware Facilities Group almost exclusively uses rubber cutting edges on it. You know, it's smaller equipment, but that's what they're using there. And what we know from folks who use those is that they require a little bit of experimentation, because in order for them to be effective, you've got to play around with your equipment and how you use it. So this is not a one size fits all. When you venture down this pathway, you want to try different things, where it goes on the mold board, what size it is, that type of thing. So there's a little bit of experimentation to find something that works for you here. And again, in our planning process, we want to think about all those accessories. We may or may not use curb guards, shoes, things like that. But just like cutting edges, we want to anticipate that we may want to have some of those on hand as spare parts. If plow shoes are critical to what we do, then we don't want to have one break off in the middle of the storm and say, well, that plow's down now. Just because we didn't have a couple of spare parts. So we want to think about what our strategy is for making sure that we have high run times for our equipment. Same with some of the other things like lights and heaters and the whole bit. Use these, but they're just fun to talk about. It's worth taking 15 seconds on. Snow melters are pretty much the province of way up north, and even then they go for long periods of time and don't get used, but they are pretty fun to look at. They use a ridiculous amount of energy because you're basically just boiling water in the winter, which is pretty energy intensive. But again, they're just fun to look at. Material spreaders, and again, we'll touch on this a little bit more when we get to Module 3 and talk about materials that we use. But again, there's different kinds. The most typical we use around here are the V-box and tailgate. We also do use some tow behinds. I'll show you those. So V-boxes, a lot of us are familiar with these. And each of these have advantages and disadvantages, which we'll touch on a little bit more in Module 3 as well. Tailgate spreaders, again, these are pretty common with a lot of us. And again, these provide a certain kind of benefit, not just in terms of their effectiveness, but in terms of what we can do with the truck during the season with this equipment on. With some of these, we're a little bit more impacted than others. Tow behind spreaders, a lot of agencies aren't familiar with this. Cecil County Public Works uses quite a few of these. These are nice, again, force multipliers, because when you're using contractors, a lot of times they'll have a plow, but they won't have a spreader. You can hook this up. It's not the most efficient spreader of material, and that's the nicest thing I can say about them. But in that kind of instance, it can work for you. So they're just another tool to consider. We don't really use these anymore, the dual dump spreaders, but or maybe they do in places like Oklahoma and things like that, where they've got a lot of ice storms, but it's not as much our bit. Same with this. This was an idea that back in the 70s that pretty much has fallen out of use. This idea of, the idea was to deliver the material right down at the road surface, but the mechanisms that were involved were so complicated that it became unwieldy. Spreader controls, we'll talk more about this in Module 3. We can have lots of different approaches. Increasingly, we tend to have fairly sophisticated spreader controls in our cabs. I'm going to talk about calibration in Module 3. If we're not going to calibrate our spreaders, there's really no point in having anything other than a manual spreader, because garbage in, garbage out. If we don't know what that spreader is doing, the computer really can't help us very much. I'll come back to that little rant in Module 3. GPS is a factor of life for a lot of us now. Again, if this is new to us in our planning process, we got to think about, if this, what I would say from a crew level or a supervision level is, if we're going to have this and have it in our system and have it on our trucks, then I want to make sure that it's something more than just Big Brother watching. I'd like to know that we're going to get some operational benefits out of it. And a lot of these systems can provide that. They can give us good feedback after the storm. They can refute those criticisms of the public that say, you know, there hasn't been a plow truck down my street, you know, in 12 hours. And I can say, well, the computer shows right here that we were there just 2 hours ago. So we should think about what we can get out of the back end of these systems, since for a lot of us, they are a fact of life. Again, I talked about equipment maintenance earlier and the importance of it in avoiding those sort of unforced errors. But we ought to think about now a little bit in our planning process, well, how is it that we maintain our equipment during the storm in particular? And it's not that there's a right or wrong way, but, you know, if we have an in-house garage, that's fine. That's great if we're an agency that can afford to do that. Are they capable? Can they handle all the things? Are they properly stocked with spare parts and things like that that are going to get them through? Because a great mechanic in, you know, the equipment bay that doesn't have the parts to replace doesn't do me a whole lot of good. Do we use private sector mechanics? Well, that's great, but if it's 2 in the morning and I've got a problem with a starter on a truck and that mechanic lives 40 miles away and I don't have a relationship with the mechanic, that doesn't necessarily do me much good. So again, it's not that that's a bad way. It's just I want to think through, you know, is this a way? If I've had a lot of downtime with our equipment in the last 4 or 5, 6 years, and I can attribute it to this, then maybe this is an area where I want to up my game a little bit. Equipment washing is one of those things where, I mean, we really need to, if we want our equipment to last, we've got to wash it between storms. But increasingly, DNREC and other state EPA agencies are going to tell us that we have to be very, very careful about that, because whether you agree or disagree, we're not going to get into that today. Once we've got salty water, it's now considered a pollutant. It's got oils, greases, what have you, and we can't discharge that to the ground without a discharge permit under the Clean Water Act. And increasingly, EPA is sort of ramping that up on us. So you can expect more and more that we're going to be told that we can't wash this equipment out in the middle of the yard. So we need to think about how we can do that if we want our equipment to last a good while. In our planning process, we want to think about towing and you know, how we're going to deal with that, whether it's our own equipment, you know, our truck that's down or in a ditch or what have you, or whether it's a vehicle that's been abandoned along the road that we need to get out of the way. Are we dealing with that? Or, you know, is that safe? Are we properly trained in dealing with that? Because I don't want somebody getting hurt because a chain or a cable snapped. I don't want to be held liable for damage to somebody's vehicle that we pulled out of a ditch. So we want to think about, well, what are our policies with this? What are our procedures? Again, it's not that there's a right answer. It's that we ought to go through and say, what do we think works for us? And I want to make sure that our whole crew knows what the rules are. Fueling locations. So, you know, and power outages. These are two things that have gotten better really just over the last 15, 20 years. If you go back a relatively short period of time ago, it wasn't unusual. Our yards didn't necessarily have backup generators. Increasingly, that's more common as a real vulnerability for our facilities. Again, not everybody enjoys that kind of thing nowadays, but increasingly that's the story. And so do the rural farms and the Wawas of the world, right? A lot of them have power backups. But we ran into some real problems. I had one problem when I was a director of public works at an unnamed organization for purposes of this story, where in the middle of a rather significant storm, we ran out of diesel fuel. And I said, you're kidding me. You're kidding me. It came down to we hadn't stuck the tanks before the storm. We knew we should do that. Somebody just forgot to do it. That's an unforced error. So we had trucks that went down until we could get more fuel in. we should think about what kind of fuel we have on hand, you know, how we're going to manage that. We should have well-established procedures to make sure that we're well fueled before the storm starts, or that we've got backups. If we run out of fuel for some reason, are we allowed to go to the Wawa and fill our trucks up or not? And how do we do that? How we store equipment, we should think about this. So a lot of us have less than perfect places to store our equipment once the season's over or between storms or what have you. To the extent that we do, that's a fact of life, but we should recognize that some of that equipment is going to get backed into, fall over, you know, suffer damage one way or another. So over time, we should be thinking about this in our planning to say, how do we arrange for better storage of our equipment so that we can protect it over the long haul? Material storage, again, for a long time, a lot of us had really poor storage. Increasingly, that has gotten better. Again, for some of us, we're not as far along that evolution, but we should be thinking about this, and we should be thinking about, and we'll talk about this in Module 3, well, what kind of storage should I have? How much material should I anticipate? And, you know, because just saying, well, I want more probably isn't a very satisfying answer for the budget manager. We should be able to come to them and go, this is what I need, and here's why I'm telling you that number. This is the size barn I need, or the type of barn that we need, or where we need it in our jurisdiction. So we should go through that process and really think, if this is an area of vulnerability for us in terms of being able to bring the fight, then we ought to focus on this and say, look, I'm not going to get that this month, but can I plan on this over the next 5 years to get better material storage? Can I get it into the capital improvements program? We'll talk about this really as a focal point in Module 3, and we'll talk in terms of this notion of freeze point depressants, and I'll explain more in that module why we call it that. But for now, you know, we'll call it for what we're used to calling it, which is rock salt or road salt. We may use some of these other salts. Again, we'll get into this. We may use sand. Some agencies are still using sand, usually as a half and half. And we'll talk about the relative merits of that in Module 3. But we'll also get into some of these things about the strategies. We'll talk about, you know, de-icing, which all of us use one way or another in almost every storm, which is a reactive process. But we'll also talk about pre-wetting our material and even using brines and things like that to do anti-icing. We'll talk about that more in Module 3, but that ought to be part of our planning process to say, hey, are we ready to take the next step with some of these things? And again, these are just some of the materials that we might use. Some of these are natural occurring salts, and some of these are sort of agglomerations of various things and even proprietary materials. We should be mindful that a lot of these are chemicals. We ought to have safety data sheets on hand and make sure that we know how to handle them for our own personal safety first and foremost, and also the corrosive effects that they can have on our equipment. Again, we're going to talk about this in Module 3, but these are sort of the three strategies that we sort of fall into one way or another in terms of use of those freeze point depressants or ice or salts or brines. We'll get back to more of that. Again, voice and data systems, we want to think about those. We may find that, you know, we've never had anything on our truck that measured the pavement temperature automatically. Maybe we find that useful. Some agencies will more than others, right? Something that monitors the dew point, we might find that effective if we're in an area where we experience a lot of black ice and things like that. So with the advancements in technology, we ought to, through our planning process every few years, come back and revisit this and say, well, we never have had this stuff, but maybe we ought to try it and see how it can change our effectiveness. Let's dip our toe in the water a little bit. I talked about this earlier in terms of communications. We should certainly know how we're going to communicate within the crews and within the chain of command. We also need to think about how we can communicate with the public and, you know, senior elected officials and things like that. Again, partly to manage their expectations, tell them about our levels of service, tell them what kind of limitations we're likely to have in the upcoming storm. It manages what they expect from us. And then if they don't get exactly what they were hoping for, they understand it perhaps just a little bit better. The jerks are going to be the jerks. That's just the way life is. But most people are kind of reasonable. And if we do a little bit of management, we'll win at least some hearts and minds. I talked about this a couple of times before. I really think that this is critical that we have a chain of command. And again, this is something we should revisit. 10 years ago, the chain of command structure we used might be fine. But in our current operation and the kind of expectations of the community and the kinds of equipment we have and technology that we're using, then maybe we need a different kind of chain of command. Again, exactly what that might be really depends on your agency. But I think this is definitely one of the things that every few years you ought to say, does our command structure work for us, both from the top down and from the bottom up? In other words, can we get clear communication about what everybody's supposed to be doing? And can we feed information from the folks that are nearest, the fight back up through the operation so that they can make smart decisions about changing strategies throughout the storm? If we have snow emergency routes, if we have areas where we say you can't park here, if we're going to put these signs up, then we should have a towing company ready to tow them. The worst thing we can do is say, you can't park here or we'll tow you, and then have somebody park there and us not tow them. Because what that does is it sends the message to the rest of the community that says, so they weren't serious about that. That guy can do it, then why can't I? And the next thing you know, you've got a worse and worse problem. You'd be better off if you didn't put the sign up to begin with. So if we're going to do this, we should mean it and we should enforce it. That's not a popular thing to do, and again, that's a communication that we ought to have with elected officials, because they're not going to like that, because they're going to get a call. So we should say, look, I need you on board with this. This is important to our operation. It's only on key routes, but we're going to enforce it and get them behind you on it. Real quickly about route planning, and this is true in larger or small organizations. I'm going to show you a couple of smaller organizations for illustration purposes. So, and to illustrate why I think these are important, it's important for every operator to know what his or her route is, any kind of special concerns about that route, things that they ought to be aware of, other resources they might have, and that kind of thing. So you can take, these can take a lot of different forms, but these are just a couple of examples. So this first one is going to be from UD's grounds maintenance folks, where they're dealing with a lot of pedestrian pathways. They've got, I think it's something like 25 or 30 miles of pedestrian pathway on the Newark campus. So, here we've got a set of notes that talk about, well, what the assignment is, what their routes are, any special concerns. If their route is in front of the university president's house, they might have a special little sort of coded message about that to be particularly mindful of that. We should tell them. We should tell them what the expectations are. If we have a particular area that's very intensive for students, then we ought to say that's a priority route. You got to make sure it's clear. These are examples. They've just taken, aerial maps that they had and marked them up with a highlighter. It doesn't need to be fancy. In fact, by not being fancy, these are very easy to revise from year to year as changes are needed. So nothing fancy whatsoever. These are from Cecil County from a number of years ago now. We just took ADC maps and marked them up with a highlighter. This is your route. And so I can see them very visually, right? And along with it, I've got some notes for the plow operator. Here's other people on your routes. Here are the roads you have. Here are fire stations, contractors, phone numbers. There should be phone numbers there, and so on. So again, gear them towards what we think is going to be useful for that plow operator. Okay, so that's sort of the process, right? And again, whether it's an actual plan that gets written and put in 3-ring binders is less important to me than the process of going through all of those things to think about. And the more you can involve the crew to get, sort of that body of experience involved and a reality check of what really works on the ground, the better. Once you're through that process, again, whether it's written or not, or in pieces or not, or whatever, you've got this plan, it should be recognized somewhere, right? Whether that's through a formal adoption, an ordinance, a ceremony, whatever. But we should let people know about it. We should then talk to the public, to the various stakeholders. You can go to Rotary Club meetings, you can go to, council meetings, things like this, talk about it, put it on your website. The more the public knows what your plan is, the more realistic they're going to be about what they expect of you. We may need to follow up out of this process with certain things. We may need to write or rewrite some standard operating procedures or guidelines, make up some laminated reference cards to go in the plow truck, hold meetings with crews and say, hey, we're changing the way we do some things. Want to tell you about it. So the follow-up to this process is important as well. You know, we've been talking to you guys for 6 or 8 months now. We've all had some good discussions. You gave us a lot of good input. This is what we came up with. This is what we decided. We took some of your ideas. We didn't take all the ideas. Thanks for the help, because we came up with what we think is a solid plan going forward. We also should use this plan to sort of support what we're going to do going forward in terms of budget requests and things like that. Imagine being able to go into an annual budget request process instead of, sort of some big round number that you just fished out of your head, and instead say, well, we've done a pretty, in-depth analysis looking at salt usage for the last, 5 or 10 years. And we've seen the averages, and we've done some statistical analysis and all kinds of stuff. And we came up with what our real needs are going forward, and we can substantiate this. And so it becomes a real dollar figure that doesn't seem like a Christmas wish, right? So we should use this process to substantiate what we're asking from the elected officials and the budget managers. Again, I talked about record keeping and sort of accountability. We ought to keep some records. Which records you keep can be very variable. I may or may not have some examples. I don't. But there are lots of examples that we can provide you if you're interested in that, of different types of records that you can keep, or forms that you can use to keep. And this over time can help build a much more robust management of your operation. So the key now is you've got this, you're budgeted, you're ready to go. You're ready for the season, basically, once you've been through this process. And that sort of brings us to a close on this. Again, in the next modules, we're going to talk about the preseason and in-season activities and what we do after each storm. And then in module 3, our big focus is going to be on those de-icing materials and strategies, and then some postseason stuff that we're going to recommend as well. And that's what you have to look forward to with that. They are a little bit less action-packed in terms of material, but they have some more video to them, which is nice. So there won't be quite as intense a module to get through as today. This is a lot to get through this program all at once with this stuff. But that's basically it for today. I know I've talked and talked and talked. I don't know whether there were any questions in the chat as we went along. If there are, we can talk about those for a minute. Or otherwise, people feel free to take yourself off a mute, and we could chat here for a moment or two. Anything in the chat, Rusty?
Nope, nothing in the chat. Sandy, do you see that one question from Wendell at Public Works? Maybe I lost Sandy. I think we lost Sandy.
Right.
Wendell, we will have to get back to you. He's got a question. He showed in late. Will he still get credit? So, we'll check.
Yeah,
Sandy.
Oh, yeah, Sandy can get back to you on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Any questions? Any thoughts? Any war stories? Any place where I was completely full of something or other? No. Okay. All right. Well, then oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I don't think you're full of anything, but it's been pretty informative. So, and we
thanks.
do use wing blades here. You know, I'm in Idaho, and we do use quite a few wing blades here. So, and also underblades. So,
Yeah, you guys are big into those. And so, yeah, we like to study you guys a lot. You know, because again, not everything you do up in, you know, the real snow belt is applicable to what we do here in, you know, the sort of mid-Atlantic, but a lot of it is, and we can use a lot of those same techniques. And we really appreciate that you guys up there, you know, like Iowa sharing their training videos is a great resource, but there's lots of other examples as well. And so it really is great that everybody sort of shares ideas, and it helps us all evolve. So, well, I hope you all will join us in the next modules. Tell your friends. We're happy to have them. We've got lots of room. And, you know, with that, I'll wish you all a good weekend, and hopefully see you guys next week. Take care.